All right, guys. So we're going to be talking about ergogenic aids today. And, first and foremost, an ergogenic aid is effectively anything that is really helping our ability to perform work. So this can be anything from wearing cleats when we're playing a field-based sport. This can be wearing a lifting belt or using lifting straps whenever we're trying to lift weights. And this can be obviously using drugs. So different things we can do to help enhance our performance. So there's a myriad of different things we can use to help enhance performance. Now, instead of ergogenic, there's also ergolytic, and these are going to be things that literally blunt the ability to work, like alcohol and learning, much less performing in high levels in a lot of sports. So we're looking at effectively trying to use different types of substances to help. Now, one thing to keep in mind is we're looking for legitimate scientific evidence to show the efficacy of these compounds. How many of you guys are familiar with what's known as the placebo effect?
Yeah, I am.
Okay, so what's the placebo effect, Tori?
Well, you basically give, it can be in like any drugs basically, and they give one that doesn't do anything, but someone would think it does. So it kind of works in their mind like that.
Yeah, yeah, and then that's the big key. It's the psychological effect. So if you look at the graph on the right, what we literally have is a pretty interesting study where what they did is they had gentlemen go through the first 7 weeks of hard training. The folks that made the greatest amount of progress on the training program, they were then kept in that training study, and now they were given anabolics for 4 weeks. And so you can see the changes in performance over those 4 weeks. I know, Norbert, we just went for a walk, buddy. I know, buddy, I know. I'm sorry. If you look at the strength gains these gentlemen had, and then you look at the bottom, you see it's placebo. So in reality, they thought they were getting steroids. So they trained harder, they pushed themselves further than they did beforehand, and they made progress, obviously, that was even better than their progress in the first 7 weeks. And that's just to show you the wonderful effects of that placebo. Where if individuals believe they're getting something that's going to help them, they in fact tend to have situations where they can perform. And the placebo has been shown to work in not just athletic performance, but when they've been trying to compare different medications for depression, and then also medications even for erectile dysfunction. For Viagra, the placebo works like 60% of the time, which means it's literally in their head, the reason why the second head's not working. Now, you have to keep in mind the other side of the placebo effect is what's known as the nocebo effect, which is you give someone a substance or something else and it creates a negative self-fulfilling prophecy that they're not going to be as good. And that's something to be very careful of, because a lot of people have a lot of nonsense going through their brains that's constantly holding them back, telling them not to push themselves as far, that they're not as able as they really happen to be. So the other day, so in the wonderful social distancing, the only people that I actually see up close is my wife and then Aaron Sasha, because he and I have still been working out together. And so he and I were talking, and I told him that, and I mean this kind of tongue in cheek, but I've never really met a really strong athletic trainer. And he kind of looks at me and goes, why? I'm like, because most of your athletic trainers, they know how to they understand all the different ways that you can hurt yourself, and they tend to naturally hold themselves back a little bit because they don't want to risk injuring themselves. And most of the people that I know that are really strong have the ability to turn off that part in their brain that says, this isn't a good idea, and go headlong hardcore into that, what would be beyond what most human beings think they're capable of. And that's part of it, is to keep in mind not just the placebo effect, which is where our effective psychology can lead us to making better progress than we would have thought otherwise, but also the nocebo effect, where we create self-limiters where it's going to cause people to underperform. because it's very likely that every single one of you has got some type of nocebo effect going on in your life. If we really went and talked you through every single thing, there's probably a couple things that you have some, for lack of a better term, nonsense going on in your head telling you that you're never going to be that good at insert this subject or insert this sport or insert this activity because of things you've been told by people that, well, honestly, we're talking out of the wrong orifice. So, questions on the placebo effect and the nocebo effect? None? All right. So, specifically, when we're looking at the research in these areas, it can be relatively difficult because some supplements and otherwise are very new, so they don't have a lot of literature behind them showing their efficacy. Others are going to have issues where they're not showing consistent results. Sorry, guys. Norbert, come here, buddy. Come on. Come here. Come. Good. Up. Okay, there you go. Hey, Norbs. So what we're going to find is there's always some limitations because what did we really look at and how did we approach it and how did we apply it? So there's not a whole lot of research out there showing the effectiveness of anabolic steroids, but there's obviously a myriad of gold medal, Olympic level winners and people that have been successful in sports thanks to the use of those substances. Because it's hard to do those types of studies because it requires a lot of money to do it, and then arguably some of the dangers of having people use large amounts of them. So any questions on kind of the limitations on finding enough good research specifically on the real efficacy of using different types of ergogenics? All right. So you've got the World Anti-Doping Code by the World Anti-Doping Association, WADA, which it turns out we don't want to use a substance or practice that can enhance sport performance, has potential to harm the athlete, and the substance or practice violates the spirit of the sport. I really love this because these are all arbitrary constructs that we like to make up to make ourselves feel better. Because in reality, can you guys name me any type of practice that has the potential to enhance sports performance that doesn't have the potential to harm an athlete and that someone could potentially get a very hard line and say it violates the spirit of the sport? And first of all, what the hell is the spirit of a sport? Is this like finding the Holy Spirit, which is, obviously an individual definition and something that's much harder to nail down? Or is this an actual like ghost that we can go find? Or I don't know. Just because I don't like talking to myself. Miss Rank, what would you describe as the spirit of sport? And you're muted.
Sorry.
It's okay.
I guess like the morals or like background of the sport.
Okay. So now, and I appreciate you throwing out your definition. So sounds good. It's the morals of the sport. What is the morality of the sport of football?
I don't know. I guess in any, don't cheat. That's kind of not cool. Use your own abilities rather than making yourself what you're not. I guess I don't know. I don't know how to put it into words.
No, but you see, it's a very hard thing to nail down. And so,
Yeah.
What's the morality of football? We want to literally hurt another human being by driving them into the ground so they cannot make forward progress. So violence is very much so an acceptable part of the sport, but we draw the line with the violence. You can hit them in the face with your hand when blocking them or stiff arming them, but punching them in the throat is looked down upon because that's a little bit more of a tender part of the human body. It's fascinating because we're applying constructs, we're applying ideas which are completely man-made. And so when we talk about the spirit of the sport, we don't really care about the spirit of football. We care about the entertainment of football, specifically when it comes to collegiate football and professional football. Now, within the confines of people playing it, they care about those arbitrary rules and constructs that have been obviously built for them. But most of them are out there to get paid, and or obviously for the fame and success and everything else that they potentially are looking for. So when we're talking about the violates the spirit of the sport, arguably the initial sport of football never really cared about having immediate timeout, never really cared about a lot of these things that we've added to it, but we're rationalizing. And therein lies the thing. Like, I'm not going to tell you guys, well, actually it's fun. If you ever look at the information on how ineffective the DARE program really has been as far as for getting kids off of drugs. And I have a kind of a funny story about how I'm a little butthurt about that program from when I grew up, but that was the wrong choice of words to use for that. I apologize. But it's interesting to keep in mind, once again, we're creating arbitrary lines and then we're acting like these are hard and fast rules. Now, when it does come to pharmacological agents, these are legitimate drugs. And obviously there's therapeutic exemptions. If you are an individual who's asthmatic and you're taking a bronchodilator, that is completely acceptable. And if you're a normal individual that doesn't have any issues with asthma and you take one of those beta agonists, that's doping and that's considered to be illegal. So like anything else, whatever group you happen to be competing through is to be aware of all of the different drugs that are illegal. Like, for example, the NFL, which obviously has a lot of individuals going through a lot of pain, opiates are completely okay as long as they're happen to be given by a doctor. But using CBD is unacceptable because that could allow them to fail the drug test. And mind you, the collective bargaining agreement changes all the time, but in reality, don't think of professional athletes as people, think of them as livestock. And then, you know, you pay more for certain cattle over others and you exploit them however you'd like. It makes things a little bit more entertaining when you watch it, and also makes it very uncomfortable for your family members when you refer to athletes like that while they're playing the sport. But then again, I like to ruin things for other people. Now, when we're talking about different examples, and we're going to go ahead and go through it, even things like caffeine when used to excessive amounts are going to cause you to fail the drug test. Now, the first group that we're going to talk about are what's known as sympathomimetics. These are going to be drugs that are effectively mimicking the sympathetic nervous system. So these are stimulants. And this is anywhere from, you can go blue collar cocaine and meth to white collar Adderall, Vyvanse, and Ritalin. What it's really going to help us do is not just potentially help us lose some weight, but it's going to increase our ability to concentrate and focus, allow us to effectively feel a little bit better. I'm sure all of you guys have had a nice little caffeine buzz where you're feeling really good, like you could do a lot, and then also decreasing sensations of pain. So it turns out overall, it's pretty useful. It does increase our heart rate, our blood pressure, which can be an issue if we happen to be not as effectively in good of shape as we need to. And it's going to help us enhance our performance by literally decreasing our action time and improving our overall like speed and power production. Now, literally there's been a number of athletes that have died because of abuse of amphetamines. And this has been caused by sometimes heat illness, sometimes through literal heart attacks and otherwise. And obviously they can be addictive, and along with it can cause issues with other problems. So in that, when it says masking of physiological danger signals, well, it turns out if you're naturally really run down, tired because you have been overreaching, overtraining, using these types of substances are going to allow you to mask that fatigue and train when otherwise your body didn't want you to, which is obviously going to increase your risk of injury. Any questions on sympathomimetics? No questions? Okay, so ephedrine, whenever I was your age, guys, was actually still a legal substance that you could buy and use as supplements. When it says they lack benefits, that's full of shit. They are awesome. You take ephedra, and I worked at the post office from 2 o'clock in the morning till 10 o'clock in the morning as a thrower. I was literally the person that would throw the packages into the different route boxes they were going to go out on, along with sorting the mail using machines known as augers. I got some old school hydroxycut that had ephedra in there, and that stuff kept me awake, kept me on my feet, and kept me getting work done. Now, when you then put ephedra in a stack with caffeine and aspirin, also known as an ECA stack, you're going to see a much greater ability to lose body fat. But the key is, guys, the risk. It is hard on the cardiovascular system. There's been young professional baseball players and athletes in other sports that have literally died of heart attacks because of it does put a greater demand on your cardiovascular system. And if it's underprepared for it, you will risk death. Now, when I give you guys my own experience and then the other information in here, I'm letting you guys know that it wasn't a smart decision, like a number of things I did when I was younger, but it's something that I'm going to share with you so that way you are getting the honest truth and not the just say no, kids, because that's full of shit. Because at the end of the day, there's a lot of people that do drugs every single day. In fact, when we talk about abusing sympathomimetics, where do we see this abuse most rampantly? Moving on to hopefully the next Abby. Ms. Capozza, go and take a guess.
I'm not really sure.
Okay. When in your life have you heard about people using amphetamines for performance enhancing?
Like professionally, like people who are in the professional field, I've heard it a lot.
Okay, in what professional field?
Can't connect to the Wi-Fi network. You might want to check
Like
the
football or baseball.
Okay, now you're thinking professional sports. Think about the rest of life. Where do you see people abusing it? I see it all the time.
Like people who weightlift.
No, not in athletics. Think outside of that world. Where do you see people utilizing a lot of sympathomimetics?
I'm not really sure.
That's okay. Do you know anybody that utilizes Adderall and doesn't have a prescription for academics?
I know that people do it, yeah.
Bingo. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you see a lot of people in academics. I've had friends that have gotten people's prescriptions and, bought Ritalin, bought Vyvanse, bought Adderall, any of those, and abused those to buoy up their athletic performance. No, don't get me wrong. There's a number of people that utilize it because they legitimately have ADD or ADHD. But there's also a number of people that are using that off-label. And then you can get into more potent things like modafinil, which is Provigil, which is definitely something that's going to help people stay awake and stay focused for longer periods of time. So when we're referring to these substances, don't just think of them only as we need to use them in sport. Think about where people can abuse these compounds in order to gain an advantage, because that's all we're trying to do. Using ergogenics is we're trying to gain an advantage, whatever we're doing. And it turns out and I'm not saying that you should do this, Abby, much less any of you guys, but if you're having a hard time focusing, staying awake, because you've had to study for all these classes and otherwise, well, you think if we maybe have you pop a Ritalin or two, you're going to be able to write a better paper if you're pulling that all-nighter, or maybe learn the information a bit faster for that exam?
Yeah.
Yeah, so therein lies the problem with drug abuse. We get upset about it whenever it's in our people playing, sports ball, but we're very comfortable or a lot more accepting of it when we utilize this as a means to enhance our job performance or academic performance. And that's something that I just want everyone to be aware of, that hypocrisy that we have of we can take certain things to enhance our performance in certain realms, but if we try to use certain substances to enhance our performance in other realms, then we get ourselves in issues. Thank you, Abby. So the next class is what's known as beta blockers. Beta blockers actually are going to work in opposition of our essential sympathetic nervous system. This is going to help us calm down and stay relaxed. So hence, it decreases performance anxiety. It's going to allow us to be steadier. Now, what this is going to do is going to decrease a little bit of your maximal performance, like power output, strength, and aerobic performance, but it can be pretty useful in enhancing focus. So when it comes to athletics, this is a really, really potent drug and useful for people that are in things like archery, rifle, golf, accuracy-based sports. But, and let's go ahead, we'll keep moving our way down the list. Brent, where do you think we see the use of beta blockers in quote unquote the real world?
Let's see here. I can see like they are, used to treat like migraines and anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess if somebody has really bad anxiety, or somebody that's got to perform in front of like singers or some, could use those to kind of take away the edge, I guess.
Exactly. So you see it abused a lot more frequently in performance musicians, people that have to speak in public and otherwise, because you literally don't have the jitters. It circumvents a lot of the real hard anxiety-ridden or anxiety-causing effects that you get from epinephrine for folks that have concerns about public speaking otherwise, because it turns out it doesn't, your body can't get up for it because it's literally being blocked. Now, obviously it's illegal in athletic performance, but they're not doing drug testing for concert musicians, for public speakers. So it's important, once again, to keep in mind what's going on. And now, don't get me wrong, it's very useful for individuals that have got high blood pressure. That's the original intent. Now, the next one that we're getting into, and thank you, Brent, is going to be caffeine. It turns out that's probably the other very much so stimulant along the lines of not a full-blown sympathomimetic, but it's obviously going to be something that's getting you up. It is going to give a lot of positive effects on performance for a lot of people. There is some genetic components like all of these. Some folks get more out of it, some folks get less. But it is one of the things that tends to help nearly everybody. You do quickly become desensitized to caffeine consumption. And if we drug tested for caffeine, I'm quite sure nearly all of my coworkers would lose their job if it became an illegal narcotic. In fact, my boss would be like a kingpin, or he would, look like the equivalent of an alcoholic for the amount that he uses on a daily basis, because it turns out this is a very societally acceptable drug to use. Don't get me wrong, its risk factors, the downsides of using too much is relatively mundane compared to obviously a number of other drugs, but it is a drug. And people and all of us just need to have, respect and understanding for these are going to give us certain advantages, but they're also going to give us certain disadvantages. Caffeine is going to mask fatigue. Fatigue is a good indicator of, well, when your body's tired and maybe you've done too much. And if we're masking that natural information from the body, we're going to be more likely to perhaps injure ourselves. Now, then we have diuretics. Diuretics are going to be pretty useful as a means to go ahead and literally help you drop water weight. So you're going to see athletes utilizing this as a means to make weight for competitions. I had a number of colleagues I competed against that would use what's known as Lasix, and that would allow them to lose a lot of water weight before the weigh-in for the competition. After they make weight, they would then use IVs to bring the fluid back in them. Meanwhile, my water manipulation was all done via heat exposure, and then obviously chugging the water back in to gain the weight back on. So you can approach this in a variety, or diuretics are also used sometimes as masking agents, so you can effectively kind of pee out and have such diluted water or urine that you're not going to be able to test for certain metabolites that they're looking for other drug tests. But like anything else, when we do have issues with diuretics, we can have legitimate possibilities of getting such an electrolyte imbalance that we can literally die from it. So something you don't want to play around with too much. Then we got recreational drugs, which we've got alcohol. Once again, societally acceptable, makes you more likely to beat your significant other, and when driving under its influence, you drive shitty but faster than the speed limit. Then we have cocaine, which I hear is a hell of a drug, obviously a heck of a stimulant, which should be kind of also a sympathomimetic. It does help with performance enhancement in a number of strength power sports. Arguably, a number of athletes over the years have used cocaine as a means to increase focus, energy, and aggression. Supposedly Bill Kazmaier used to thoroughly enjoy using it before World's Strongest Man events, because being that big, jacked, and on coke would make you incredibly terrifying to have to compete against. marijuana, which makes you more likely to eat a lot of Taco Bell, and also makes you more like, if you do get behind the wheel, you drive shitty, but you drive slower than the speed limit on average. And that's based on actually peer review, and is relatively mundane, but because of effectively mostly racist arguments, it became illegal because that's cool. And then we've got nicotine, another drug that's societally has its issues. It is actually a nootropic, helps a little bit with focus and the ability to obviously be a slight stimulant to stay awake. The problem with nicotine is typically the delivery mechanism, whether we're doing that through smoking, vaping, or chewing, all have a number of increasing of cancer risks. So if you're going to try to use nicotine as a nootropic, you're best to go by patch or gum. And is something that's probably not going to give you the greatest effect. I like how it says no ergogenic effects, because it turns out that's when people don't really understand how things work, because alcohol actually does help desensitize pain a little bit. So I know some lifters that use a small amount of it. Marijuana is actually pretty useful in more artistic sports, and or also to help some people calm down from anxiety. That's why you see athletes like snowboarders and otherwise using it. And it can potentially decrease performance with all of those. And then remember, always be careful about mixing your drugs, because what's the problem with combining alcohol with caffeine? Now you have enough energy to do all the dumb things you're thinking about doing while you're drunk. So, any questions about recreational drugs, or anything you'd like me to go ahead and field right now on that? Because I love talking about drugs, even though I don't use them. Other than a little bit of caffeine. I like my green tea. Nothing? We're gonna keep working our way down. Sierra, any questions about any drugs or applications of them for sports performance or performance in general?
Well, you kind of touched it a little bit, but I was just wondering why, like, we become desensitized to caffeine. Because, like, like, a few semesters ago, I would drink Starbucks, like, all the time to stay awake, but now it doesn't do anything for me.
Yeah, so we have a certain amount of receptors for, different compounds. And so caffeine is technically kind of a class of, a lighter form of amphetamine stimulants, where effectively we get a down regulation of those receptors so we have to use more and more to have the same effect. Kind of like when you look at, like type 2 diabetes, it's not a lack of insulin, it's a lack of receptors that gets us into trouble. So it's one of those things you just got to be careful of. Okay. And Jared will finish with having you ask the questions about the lab. So any other questions about drug use? How you should go on a vision quest or otherwise once in your life? I'm kidding, kind of. So now I'm probably going to start swearing a lot just because I like to, specifically when I talk about things that I'm very passionate about. And so we're going to talk about anabolic steroids. Now, when referring to anabolic steroids, these are usually going to be things that are testosterone or testosterone analogs. Now, testosterone has both androgenic and anabolic effects. Anabolics meaning we're building ourselves bigger, androgenic meaning masculinizing effects. So it turns out testosterone is awesome. Testosterone is not just going to increase muscle mass, it's going to increase bone mass, and it's going to typically overall enhance performance. It's relatively easy to pass drug tests when you're using anabolics, as long as you know when the drug tests are and you're aware of how quickly the drugs are going to leave your system. So like anything else, it definitely increases lean mass, increases strength potentially, definitely is going to help with decreasing fat mass and help with recovery from exercise. And it seems to be in a dose-dependent response, so that the more you take for the longer period of time, the greater differences you're going to have. Now, we've got the graph in the bottom right, and it's going to show you that systemic use for long periods of time and the total amount of lean mass changes you're going to have an individual having to have, and you can see how it just really shoots up once we're going into massive amounts over very long periods of time. But what's interesting is when we're looking at this graph in the upper right, now this is from Basin et al. And this was not based on all. That's what we're going to get to in a little bit. That's from Harvey in 91, where you can see that when individuals were given steroids or a placebo, notice across the board, they're going to have made better progress using the anabolic agents than whenever they happen to be training naturally. Now, when it comes to that increasing body mass and fat-free mass and decreasing fat mass, it can also change a little bit of blood biomarkers and otherwise, and it's very important when you're looking at the dosage that's being applied to the individual and effectively the period of time that we're utilizing it for. Now, what we have on the right is Basin et al.'s 96 research article, which is hands down my favorite article to ever talk about when it comes to the use of anabolics. And here's why. He took and divided his subjects into 4 groups. The first immediate deviation was you were either given a placebo, so you got injected once a week with nothing, or you got injected once a week with steroids, and I believe it was about 500 milligrams of a testosterone preparation. Now, he then divided that 2 group into 2 subgroups. The 2 subgroups were individuals that were either given a workout plan or they were told to be sedentary for the entire training program. Now, as we're looking up over here, and you guys can see the effects of the change in fat-free mass, change in triceps area, change in quadricep areas, bench press strength, and squat strength. And notice that's in kilograms. What's the interesting thing that should pop out to you guys as you're looking on through? And Courtney, you are up.
I'm not really sure like what you're asking.
Okay. So the blue bars is individuals that were given testosterone. The red bars are the individuals that were given the placebo. Is there anything that the individuals on the placebo were making the same amount of progress as the individuals given testosterone?
I mean, I would say as the testosterone increased overall, the placebo increased. Not necessarily always true, but for the most part it did.
Okay. So now you're right. You were seeing those increases. Now let's dig deeper. Okay. Notice that the 2 right bars, so the red and the blue, that's the group that had exercise. The 2 left bars, that's going to be the group that had no exercise. Now let's look at just the quadricep size change. Notice the group that literally didn't exercise, but were given steroids, gained actually slightly more muscle mass on their quads than the group that worked out. And then when we look at the triceps gain, the group that, once again, didn't exercise gained a massive amount of more muscle mass on their arms than the individual that happened to be, once again, working out given the placebo.
Are you asking why that happened?
No. But do you see what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, why that happened is the testosterone. But notice the only thing is notice the strength metrics. The bench press and squat numbers went up a bit more for the individual working out than the person who wasn't. But even then, it wasn't that much of a difference between the 2. And the person that was sitting on the couch, once again, didn't even have to work out, nearly gained as much bench press strength as the person that worked out for 6 weeks. So the big thing to make sure you guys understand when you're looking at this is the simple reality of when people use steroids, they make a lot more progress than people that don't. And that's whether or not they're working out or otherwise. So one thing that's been frustrating for me, obviously still trained and competed for years. And on occasion you'll get somebody, of course, it's like somebody on some form of social media, they're always talking about like, if they trained hard, they'd be jacked like me. Like, no, look at the damn numbers. You can literally see how if you are right in the roid pony, you are going to be not just a little bit more muscular, but massively more muscular than someone that's training naturally. And the same is to be said about the strength side, where at least the strength side is a little bit more competitive. So that's where you can get guys that are using a bunch of steroids, but they're training like an idiot. So they're not actually that strong, because it turns out their program sucks, but drugs really help with buoying up muscle size and strength to a lesser extent, but you still need to have a better program. Does that make sense to all of you guys?
Yes.
Thank you, Jake. So, taking a large amount is going to definitely help buoy you up. It seems to be a situation where you get a little bit more increase in type 2 muscle fiber than type 1, and you're going to literally increase the amount of nuclei, that multinucleation of your muscle mass, which literally means it's easier to maintain that muscle mass for the rest of your life. So in reality, if we really cared about drug testing with professional athletes, it shouldn't be you pop once and you're suspended for this period of time. You pop once, you are suspended forever, because you have literally changed your body physiologically in a way that no one else can ever really catch up to you. But that's if we cared. Well, we really don't. And it's also going to have potential positive effects on your cardiorespiratory performance, because it causes an increased signaling for erythropoietin, which in turn is going to lead to increased amount of red blood cell number and total volume. So you can actually have a little bit more aerobic capacity thanks to utilizing, but it also can increase the risk of death because of too high of hematocrit. Your blood becomes too viscous, and you can effectively stroke out because of it. So it is going to help with also just the simple recovery from trainers, so retraining. So if you're using anabolics, you can recover faster. If you can recover faster, you can train more often. You can train more often, you can make more progress. You can once again become a better athlete. So it is an important thing to understand that it really does make a big difference. And within that, guys, this is super physiological doses. Even when we go to normal physiological doses, it's going to be influenced by not just how much testosterone you have, your free level of testosterone, and then your total amount of androgen receptor. And even then, it's the CAG repeats in your genetics that's going to influence your androgen receptor sensitivity, which in turn is going to affect your body's response to testosterone. And that's why individuals can have a quote unquote normal testosterone but have low testosterone symptoms, and individuals can have a high testosterone level but don't really seem to be that androgenized, and then vice versa. People that have a relatively normal, only slightly high testosterone level, carry around excessively larger amounts of muscle mass than one would suspect. So, well, there's some issues with it, because it turns out, you can get way better than everybody else way faster. And it does have some issues with affecting both genders. When it happens to be done with a male, if you do this too early, you're going to have issues with a stunting of your growth. If you use, obviously, even necessarily too much, testicular abnormalities is really referring to your testicle shrink. You can have what's known as gynecomastia, and that's due to excessive estrogen because you're using so much testosterone. A certain amount as a male of your testosterone converts over to estrogen naturally, and if that happens at too high of a rate, you start to get breast development. Then you can also have issues on the female side, which is going to really throw your hormonal cycle for a loop, along with causing more development of masculine characteristics. So that's where you'll see some ladies start to develop a much stronger jaw. Some of the other changes you'll see, like the secondary sex characteristics of increased body hair. Another one that happens, but boy, you got to really know that person to see it, is it actually causes clitoral hypertrophy in females. So that's something to be mindful of. And as far as increasing your risks of certain cancers, prostate is more or less due to, that's actually relatively unfounded and untrue. It's more of the abuse of it that can be issue. Whereas liver toxicity is usually due to using oral anabolics, because those are very hard on your liver. So arguably, if you're going to use anabolics, the safest way to use them is to actually inject them into your body, specifically if you know the type that you're utilizing. You can also use, creams, patches, pellets. There's a lot of various options out there. And when it comes to cardiovascular risks, once again, if you're not aware of what's going on, in your body, you're going to see pretty much no matter what, a decrease in HDL and an increase in LDL. So if you already have borderline blood biomarker levels, you're going to cause this to get really bad or pretty bad. As far as the issue with causing death and otherwise, typically it's individuals that are already unhealthy, and then you give them testosterone, which for those of you guys that are female in the class, having high levels of testosterone is awesome. I didn't realize that other human beings had feelings, much less should I even care about those feelings until probably my mid to late 20s, because I was so high on life and really full of myself. It does have a lot of positive, higher testosterone levels, effects on your psychology, actually makes you less moody, tends to make you obviously driven. Yes, you can bring up the wonders of the effects on sex drive, but in reality, what happens is if you give a guy who's very low testosterone, older, out of shape, obese, you give him testosterone, now he feels energetic, now he's got some fire back in him, not just to, you know, be romantic, but also to be physically active. And so he effectively takes his old car that's been sitting in the garage for 30, 40 years and never been taken care of, and then tries to take it out for a run and stomps on the gas, and then he has a heart attack. Because it turns out his car, aka his body, is pretty heavily untrained. And so we have to be careful with that. Now, when it comes to the emotional side of it, the aggression, violence, roid rage, and otherwise, it hasn't really been very well identified in the literature. It's been more or less kind of one of those things that's been a repeated lie enough times that it gains truth. In reality, testosterone seems to magnify the type of individual that they were beforehand. And then it also depends on, obviously, the dosage. Individuals that are using insane superphysiological dosages can, in fact, if they're already a jerk, they're going to be a huge jerk. Because it turns out anabolics tend to make you feel stronger, faster, more capable, and more powerful than you normally have been. And obviously, for some folks, that becomes a power trip. As far as contacting hepatitis and HIV, that's if you're sharing needles. Decreasing lifespan is 100% true, specifically when we're using maximal amounts of it. The life, or very high amounts, the light that burns twice as bright burns half as long. It can increase the risk of birth defects. In fact, if you're male and using enough of it, it will sterilize you. So not for the long term, but render you infertile for at least a duration of you using it, and then a certain amount of time for your body to start to re-regulate your hypothalamus, pituitary, gonad axis. And as far as the effects of long-term abuse, it's the dose that makes the poison. So there's a lot of people that use hormone replacement therapy, and it really helps enhance their quality of life. And there's a number of people who use this recreationally to be, you know, massive and huge. And a lot of the individuals, a number of them, you know, have died early because of these issues of having things like heart attacks. In fact, one of the better research studies I saw in this area was the fact that professional bodybuilders, so like people that won the Mr. Universe, pre-1960s, and that's when they argue when bodybuilding was still natural, people weren't using drugs, and if they were, they're using incredibly small amounts. The average lifespan of the guys that won the Mr. America and Mr. Universe was in their 80s. But post 1960s into the 1970s, so aka, you know, the Schwarzenegger golden era of bodybuilding, the average lifespan of those individuals has only been into the 60s. So they went from living longer than your average American, probably because they lived a healthier diet and were more active, to actually not living as long, probably because of, once again, the demands of using those super physiological amounts of anabolics for long periods of time. Now, here's the thing at the end of the day. If you or anyone you know is legitimately interested in trying to use these compounds to enhance performance, don't hesitate to have them contact me. We'll have a true, frank conversation about the pros and cons, because it goes way deeper than what we've touched on so far. The big things to keep in mind is, yes, it is going to have negative effects on your longevity, specifically depending on the dosage you're using. But a lot of people aren't leveraging their performance, their capabilities, before they really start using these substances. So, you know, you get the bro that goes into the gym for 6 weeks and barely makes any progress because all he's doing is bench press and curls, and like the swole gods have forsaken me. And, you know, for that, they go and, you know, they got to ride the roid pony. When in reality, they're not actually making sure that their numbers, that they have a good program that's going to give them the type of progress they want. specifically when you are someone that's not using substances that are going to enhance your performance. And then the other side of it is when you're looking at specific situations, such as, I'll pick on Jake, when you're talking about the military setting, you can have a lot of individuals that get concussions. It causes major issues for some folks with normal hormonal production, so they actually do need to get on testosterone replacement therapy. I've heard a lot of individuals in like the spec-oc communities and a lot of the very like hardcore of the military special units, where those guys effectively have the testosterone of a 12-year-old girl because they're so overstressed, under-recovered, and that's going to cause things to become even worse, because testosterone is important not just for masculine features, but also for things like normal, healthy heart function and effectively just feelings of well-being for an individual. So a lot of folks might turn to certain substances, meaning like SSRIs and otherwise, when in reality, what they probably really need is just some more testosterone, because it's awesome, but the key is if you use too much, it's an issue. Also, hopefully you guys can read the comic that I have up there. I find it to be pretty entertaining, but it, yeah, I just like to cause trouble sometimes. Any questions about anabolics? I'm more than happy to, have a true, honest conversation with you guys about their use.
Good to go.
No questions, Jake? You don't want to get on the super soldier serum?
That would be great, no, but I actually agree with that, because I actually wrote a paper back in English about the same exact thing, about people going to ranger school with like normal ranges of like testosterone, the human growth hormone, stuff of that matter, and coming out small, broken, and low levels of testosterone. So
yeah, the military stuff is insane. Kind of like MMA fighters, boxers. Like I've seen stuff with football players that, at the end of the season, they've got barely any testosterone levels, so their muscle mass is declining, their performance is declining, they're increasing the risk of injury. So, and the quality of life obviously isn't there. So, I've obviously told you guys before, get the complete blood panel, get all that information so you kind of know where you're at when you're feeling good. So that eventually, if you're not feeling good, you can at least kind of look back and figure out what changed. But, the other side, when we're looking and talking about anabolics, which is, sports, we like to, prim and be proper and like, the ethics of the sport. We got the Geneva Convention when it comes to war, but other than that, is there a whole lot of ethics? And like, if it's you, the goal was a General Patton is to make the other person die for their country, not to die for yours.
sounds pretty straightforward to me. Yeah.
So hence, if people are in the military, police and otherwise, if you're going to use certain substances to enhance your performance, my only thought, like anything else, when you use any drug, is to use it in an intelligent fashion and be deliberate with what is your goals for what you're trying to. In fact, I've met firefighters that are on testosterone replacement therapy in their 20s and 30s because of the stress of the job. It's caused them to be hypogonadal and in turn caused them to have way lower performance. And I am not a small human. If a firefighter is coming in to pull me out of the house, I would prefer if it's a guy that's pretty big and jacked, or gal that's big and jacked, as opposed to a cross-country runner that, let's be honest, guys, if they're dragging me out, I hope they're just doing it head first and not feet first, because I don't want to have my head bouncing off all those stairs. So if you guys got no other questions about anabolics, let's go ahead and we're going to dig into what you guys have probably heard of andro. It was popularized by Mark McGuire and Sammy Sosa back in the day. Big Mac was definitely using more than andro. DHEA is a precursor for effectively andro and then testosterone. Your body naturally needs some. It's more useful if you're an older individual to potentially supplement with these to enhance your natural hormonal levels, but it's nothing that's really going to have this massive effect on enhancing performance. Using exogenous growth hormone can be a useful way to enhance recovery, because remember, that causes every tissue in your body to recover faster and decreases fat mass. So that's pretty awesome. It doesn't really seem to have a big overarching effect on performance. It's usually used synergistically with testosterone, but growth hormone naturally declines as we get older. So that's why you hear people touting, growth hormone use later on in life as a kind of a potential fountain of youth type therapy. And that's when we're not talking about, once again, excessive usages of it. When we talk about excessive uses of it, That's where we get things like acromegaly, which is where hands and feet grow beyond their normal size, and jaws also. We can have issues with an excessive strain on the heart, along with potentially getting to become insulin resistance from the use. And one thing that's fascinating is I've known a number of bodybuilders and powerlifters from the early thousands that used a lot of this, and it literally causes also an increasing of your digestive size or digestive system size. So a number of them, thanks to the literal hypertrophying of their large intestine, effectively, oh gosh, what is the name of it? A fistula? No? Is it fistula? Might be fistula. But effectively, they develop infected pockets inside of their GI and had to have excessive amounts of their large intestine resected. So some of those guys, because of human growth hormone abuse, and this is where you think about peptides for you guys, growth hormone peptides, can literally lead to people having to have significant amounts of their large intestine removed, and then you get to poop in a bag for the rest of your life and really worry about dehydration because you can't pull water out of your bowel like you once did. Fun fact, eh? So we'll touch on physiological agents whenever we talk on Friday, but are there any questions about the substances that I've covered so far? No? Hadley, if you had to pick one, what would be your drug of choice?
If I had to do a drug,
I didn't say you had to. I just said if you had the options.
well,
Technically, we have the options.
you already know that I do caffeine every single day.
There we go. So you're going to be going with some form of stimulant.
Yep.
That's okay. That's okay. Have you cut back a little bit on the Monster since you're no longer on campus, or?
I'm drinking a Monster right now.
Guys, hey, once again, that's not a judgment. The key is, guys, when it comes to your alcohol use, your caffeine use, your nicotine use, any drug that you guys use, it's making sure that you have a good relationship with that drug. So if you need to do, the white can Monster like 4 times a day just to get through your life, like, is that a good relationship with that, Hadley?
No, I don't drink 4 a day.
Exactly. So how much caffeine do you think you take in a given day?
I just have one Monster, and I think it's like 180 milligrams.
Okay. And do you have certain days where you don't do caffeine?
Since we've been in quarantine, yeah.
Okay. Now, how bad are the days where you don't use it?
They're not terrible, but I also sleep pretty late those days.
Well, yeah, because you're not using stimulants to wake yourself up. That's okay. It's okay to let your body naturally do what it wants to. And we haven't really talked about sleep a whole lot in the class, but keep in mind when they say like average person needs 8 hours, it's plus or minus 2. So some people legitimately need 10 hours of sleep every night to feel good, and otherwise that's fine. Like whatever you need is, if you can, if your lifestyle allows it, like don't give yourself trouble, and especially don't have to use amphetamines to prop yourself up. So does that make sense? Like kind of a healthy relationship with the drug, and then the people that to get out of bed they need to do a quad shot of espresso, and then they're drinking coffee throughout the day, and then they switch over to diet soda until like 10 o'clock at night, and then they're shriveled up, beaten down adrenals finally give out, and they pass out for 6 hours and then repeat it again. Is that kind of making sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So since you're back with your parents, you're not like drinking a lot just to get through it, are you?
No.
Okay, good. I'm kidding on that one. Thank you, Hadley. But at the end of the day, guys, once again, it's just having a good relationship with these compounds, understanding why you're using them, understanding what are the potential negative effects of using them, and effectively how addictive are they. I'm sure all of you guys either know someone or you come from that family of people that have legitimate substance issues. It can be with alcohol, it can be with opiates, it can be with a wide variety of different substances. So making sure that you're just being deliberate with the choices that you're making, and also trying to understand, where's the dosage of any substance that that enhances your life, and at what point is that dosage taken away from your life. So if you guys want a good book on the subject of just general drug use that I thoroughly loved reading, it's called From Chocolate to Morphine. It's very fascinating. It goes from obviously anything from just eating chocolate and effectively, you know, sugar and otherwise, all the way to hardcore opiates. It talks about hallucinogens, marijuana, alcohol, painkillers. Like it is fascinating. I really enjoyed it because I'm just someone that kind of enjoys learning, but obviously I'm not exactly trying to trip the light fantastic, but I at least want to understand how things work and not necessarily like this drug bad, this drug good. Instead, like, let's have a real conversation. Let's really think about these things. So to wrap up, Jared, what's the question that you have for the lab? And we can go ahead and run through those, and then we'll go ahead and call it a day.
I had a couple actually, but so you done several reps for like the first couple lifts, and are we supposed to take the highest of those numbers, or are we?
Yes, you just take the highest rep in speed for both peak and mean for each of those sets. So
okay, and is the
best one there? If there's one rep, you just use that one rep.
Okay, and then for the true percentage, do we just add both of those numbers and divide by 2?
So for the true percentage, you're going to take whatever the weight is on the bar and then divide that by their max, which was supposedly 315.
Oh, I thought on the Excel sheet you just had 285.
That would have been his heaviest set, I believe.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so he didn't, so that would have been his 90% was 285. And so since a true like 90% of 315 is technically like, it's 283.5 instead of, 280, instead of getting that, we did 285. So in reality, he lifted closer to like 90.5 or 90.6%. That's the true percentage.
Okay, so it's pounds divided by the what?
By the true max that he has, which is 315.
Okay.
Good. What other questions can I help you guys with?
I think that's it. What about the velocity load relationship?
So that's where you need to plug all that information into Microsoft Excel. And then from there, you're going to go ahead and figure out what that linear relationship, like we made in a number of the labs together, where you're going to make the scatter plot. Then you're going to right click, add trend line, and then it's going to put that line on there. And then you're just going to look at the slope in the equation. So you're going to look at the equation for the lines, that gives you the slope and the intercept. And then you can also look at the correlations. It'll be like the R value that'll also be up there.
Okay.
So is that good for answering your questions?
I believe so.
Awesome.